This needs to be your next dragon. This is a Rankins dragon, Pagona Henry Lawsoni, the mini dragon. It has all the same care and personality as its larger cousin, the bearded dragon, Pagona Viticeps, but is half the size, making it the perfect pet if you're limited on space. Just like the bearded dragon, these guys are native to Queensland, Australia. Unlike their larger cousin, that can grow up to 18 to 24 inches. These dragons max out at a size of 6 to 12 inches, with females being a little bit larger than the males. Their diet in the wild consists of native insects, desert vegetation such as succulents and cacti, as well as some flowers and greens. In captivity, we feed the largest variety of foods as possible to mimic what they would be doing in the wild, which would be foraging for whatever insects or vegetation is available. For insects, our staple diet would include crickets, roaches, dubias being the most readily available, although lobster roaches are good too if you can get a hold of them, as they have a softer exoskeleton, making them easier to eat. Mealworms and superworms, maybe every other week. They're definitely not a staple food. They're used more as a treat. Pinky mice, very occasionally, and most maybe once a month. They're very high in fat, but they are good for breeding females to put on weight after or even before breeding season. Calcium worms are good for before and after egg laying to recover some of the calcium lost from making eggs. Hornworms, again as a treat, maybe 1 to 2 times a month. Next, vegetation. The darker the greens, the better. Dandelion, mustard, turnip, collard, beet, all great greens. Green and red leaf lettuce, romaine lettuce, endive, escarole, carrot tops, and the carrots chopped very small or shredded. Kale is controversial. I feed it in small amounts and have never had a problem with any of my animals. You just don't want to strictly feed kale and nothing else. As with all of these, the biggest variety is best. Never stick to one food item and only feed that. A varied diet is always best. The 2 foods I suggest to never feed your animals are 1, spinach, which is actually filled with calcium, but it contains a natural chemical called oxalate, which prevents your animal's body from being able to absorb the calcium. The second is iceberg. It contains absolutely no nutritional value, so technically it's not bad for your animal, it just isn't good either. It's mostly just water, which if you have a very dehydrated animal, you have a rescue animal that's very dehydrated, we would recommend feeding iceberg just to get some hydration back into your animal. You just don't want to continue to feed that as the only food they're eating because it has no nutritional value. Other vegetables you can feed your dragons are bell peppers, zucchini, and yellow squash, carrots, as mentioned earlier. Make sure they're either cut into very small pieces or shredded. Cucumbers and sweet potatoes. All of these vegetables must make sure they're cut into either very small pieces or shredded so your animal can eat them. This is just a short list. There are many other veggies you can add into their diet. One vegetable to never feed any of your animals is tomatoes. They're way too acidic and are not good for any reptiles. Now that we know a little bit about our dragon and what to feed them, let's talk about how to house them. Enclosure. For a single or pair, like we have right here, I would recommend a minimum of a 40-gallon terrarium, which is what this is right here, 36 inches by 18 inches by 18 inches. And preferably a front opening enclosure, like this one right here. With top opening enclosures, your animals feel more threatened whenever you reach down into their enclosure, because in the wild, anything that comes down on them is usually a predator and wants to eat them, which causes a more frightened and skittish animal. With a front opening enclosure, you can come in at the animal's level and it can see who you are and eventually learn it doesn't have to be afraid of you. A 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot enclosure would be perfect to keep a trio or even 1.3 in. 1.3 meaning 1 male and 3 females, not 1 1/3 of an animal. That would be a little weird. A good rule of thumb to remember is, and this goes with pretty much any reptile enclosure, the more animals you keep in an enclosure, the enclosure has to be big enough for that amount of animals you have in it. You just need to make sure you put more hides and basking spots, at least one for each animal you have in the enclosure. You want to make it so that any animal can bask or retreat to a hide at any point by itself. You want hides on the cool end and the warm end. Cool end hides can also be humid hides by adding misted sphagnum moss under the hides. And basking spots, obviously, on the warmer end. Basking spot here, basking spot here. I have 2 dragons in this enclosure, a male and a female. Hopefully be breeding later this year. You can add a lot of climbing areas, as in the wild you would find them perching or basking on fallen logs and trees and climbing on rocks. But they are more terrestrial animals, meaning they spend most of the time on or near the ground. So they need more horizontal space rather than vertical space. A 12 to 24 inch height for the enclosure is good. I provide 2 to 4 inches, depending on the size of the enclosure, of substrate, as these guys love to dig, and the females need the space to dig when it's egg laying time. You just have to keep a close eye on them during egg laying season so you know where the eggs are buried. There's nothing worse than knowing you have a dragon that has laid eggs but not know where in the 4 foot by 2 foot enclosure with 4 inches of substrate that she has laid them. I actually keep wireless cameras on my animals, particularly during egg laying season, for this very reason. So when I know she has laid, I can scroll through the footage and see exactly where she laid, so I don't have to search the entire enclosure. Then I can take out the eggs and get them into the incubator. The correct temps and humidity are hard to try and control in a small enclosure and naturally incubate them. Plus, the adults in the enclosure may try to eat the babies when they hatch, or try to eat the eggs that are being laid, which I have had in the past. In captivity, we don't have to abide by the laws of nature, survival of the fittest. We can take the eggs and set them up in an incubator set to the perfect temperature and humidity to get every baby the best chance of hatching. We can even help those animals that wouldn't hatch in the wild because they were either missing an egg tooth or having an undeveloped egg tooth, or they were too weak for some reason to cut out of the egg by cutting the egg for them. Very carefully, of course. So, substrate is another highly controversial subject in keeping reptiles. You have people that say no substrate or just paper towels is best because they can ingest loose substrate and get impacted. And yes, that can happen. But if you have a healthy dragon, the odds of that happening are very, very slim. I have always kept my dragons as natural as possible, both Rankins and Beardie dragons. I've used sand, organic soil, organic gardening soil, make sure that there are no chemicals in the soil like Miracle Grow. I always use straight organic potting soil. I have in some of my other enclosures. Excavator clay by Zoomed is a great choice because you can form tunnels or caves, which they love to climb in, climb on. The only time I've used paper towels is for my hatchlings. I keep them on paper towels until they're at least 6 months old. They are much more prone to impaction at a smaller size, smaller animal, ingesting substrate, more likely to get impacted. I do use and suggest anyone else to use dishes to feed your animals on. Doing this greatly decreases the chance your animal swallowing any of the substrate while eating their food. Okay. Hydration. Yes, these are arid-loving animals that love the dry outback of Australia, but all animals, especially ones that live in the desert, need water. So, you want to keep a full, clean, shallow water dish in their enclosure at all time. It will need to be cleaned out and refilled fairly regularly, as they will soak and go to the bathroom in the water. I also lightly mist my enclosures once a day, usually in the morning, acting like the morning dew. The dragons seem to like licking the water droplets off the walls and cage furniture more than out of the actual dishes. But you still always want to have access to water via a water dish, like so. So, what do you think? Is a Rankins dragon your next dragon? Comment us down below and let us know what you think, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.